Over to you, Dr. Suraj.
Yeah,
Can I start?
yeah. Thank you, Dr. Narayan Prasad. Respected teachers and friends. So we have heard Dr. Anila about the requirement and how do we satisfy her. So gunning for the diagnosis. So before I start, I would like to thank all these people, Dr. J. Balasubramaniam, for giving me this opportunity. And when we were doing our post-graduation at MMHRC Madurai, he was a source of inspiration because he was doing so many procedures which we could only dream of at that time. Dr. Sampath Kumar, my teacher, and who introduced me in the wonderful world of nephrology. The third person is Dr. Mukundarajan. He was our radiologist at Meenakshi Mission Hospital. Actually, he taught me how to do the renal biopsy. So he taught me how to point out and how to do biopsies and how to do ultrasound guided procedures. And Dr. Georgie Nainan, who was my mentor, and he still is, and who and taught me that nephrologists should be capable of doing procedures alone without any outside help. And they are the best people to do procedures on CKD patients and nephrology patients. So this is how renal biopsy used to be in the past. We used to shoot wild. Sometimes we were like Shikari Sambu, we got lucky. But nowadays with cutting edge technology and with the newer advances, we are able to do things with precision, like laser guided snipers. So like Dr. Anila said, it is the gold standard diagnostic procedure in nephrology. What started as an accident became the final word in diagnosis. There are multiple ways of performing the procedure, which we'll see in this talk. And like all procedures, it has its own share of problems. So coming to the history of renal biopsy, the renal biopsy was actually founded by a gynecologist and a surgeon, George Michael Eddie Balls. So what happened was initially in Bright disease, there used to be what was described as a renal edema. And the thought process was if you relieve the edema by doing a renal capsule stripping technique, then you can bring up the kidney and reduce the symptoms to a very large extent. So he did a large number of cases of renal capsule stripping and found out that you could, by looking under the microscope, you could make out the glomeruli, tubules, etc. And thus renal biopsy was born. The percutaneous renal biopsy is attributed to Niels Alvall. He started doing percutaneous renal biopsies in 1944 with the help of a retrograde pyelography and with the help of X-rays. But he had a few early mortalities, and so he got discouraged and didn't publish his results. In the late 1940s, there was a study from Cuba. So they showed that percutaneous renal biopsy was helpful in finding out diagnosis. And in 1951, Paul Iverson and Klaus Brunn, they endorsed that percutaneous renal biopsy was helpful. In 1954, Karl and Murke, they described what is performed now, renal biopsy in the prone position. They used the Wim Silverman needle at that time. So coming to the Indian scenario, renal biopsy has got a very important role in the birth of Indian nephrology as well. So Dr. K.S. Chugh is the father of Indian nephrology, as we all know. So in 1956, after his, while doing his MD, he wanted to do the thesis on renal biopsy. But then at that time, nephrology was not at all a specialty in India, and the medical faculty at that time wanted him to do his thesis on gastroenterology or cardiology. But then he went to the court, got a favorable ruling, and he did the evaluation of renal biopsies as a diagnostic procedure in medical diseases of the kidney, about 50 cases at that time. And after that, the Indian nephrology was born. So what is our armamentarium? So what are the guns that we use? So this is the historical guns. So we used to use Wim Silverman needle or Franklin needle way back. So the principle was the same. There used to be an outer sheath, then there used to be an obturator, which we used to position just above the renal capsule. Then there was a longer needle with the cutting prongs, which used to be introduced into the kidney. And then a small bit used to be taken into us, and which was given. But it was quite barbaric, and catastrophes used to be there. So the thought for newer biopsy mechanisms came in. And then came the advent of the true cut biopsy. The principle was that there was a needle with a slot for specimen. This needle was introduced into the lesion, and then a sheath was introduced over it, so that a part of the tissue was embedded into the notch, and this needle could be easily taken out, and then we were able to get adequate specimen from that. Then came the semi-automated or manual biopsy guns. So here there was a lag time between the introduction of the needle and the introduction of the sheath, however fast you may be. And then came the automated guns. The advantage of automated guns was it was spring loaded, and it was very fast. So you could shoot immediately. And so the morbidity was less. And there is a study from Agarwal, SK, Sethi, etc. And they compared the use of semi-automated and automated guns and found that automated guns were better in the sense that there were fewer complications, though the biopsy yield was the same. So what are the techniques that we use? So there is a wide variety of techniques that can be used to obtain a specimen. The earliest was the open biopsy, which is not at all practiced nowadays. So then came the laparoscopic technique. So laparoscopic technique still has a role. So it is helpful in patients who have got who are morbidly obese, who have got coagulopathies, who have got renal artery aneurysm wherein you don't want to meddle with too much. Then patients who have got cysts, cyst when you want to take a tissue in between the cysts, etc. So in such patients, you can go in for a laparoscopic biopsy, but then, and there are various approaches for that, but then it is costly because you're taking the patient into the operation theater and you have the associated anesthesia risks along with it. Then the blind, which was practiced earlier, then you mark, in earlier days, pyelography was used to mark the kidney, and then various markers were used. And then after marking, it was done in the blind technique. Then came the blind technique with USG marking. So we used to mark the lower pole when the patient held the breath, the deepest inspiration. Then the depth from the skin was marked, and then you used to take up the patient for a blind biopsy. Then came the gold standard, what we do now, the real-time ultrasound guided percutaneous renal biopsy. Then you have a CT guided biopsy. The problem with CT guided biopsy is that it cannot be done percutaneously because we need to introduce the needle bit by bit and then do the CT to confirm that the trocar is at the position and then do the biopsy. And you are exposing the patient to unwanted radiation. So CT is not, CT guided techniques are reserved only for certain conditions. Then you have the transjugular biopsy, which can be used in patients who have got coagulopathy, CLD, etc. But you need higher training, and then it is a bit, there are risks associated with which we'll see later. So if you look at the history of nephrology, so this is an example of how renal biopsy used to be in the earlier days. So they used to do the pyelography, then there was a grid there. And it was using the grid, the area where you intended to puncture was marked, and then the biopsy used to be performed in a blind manner. So when you do a renal ultrasound guided renal biopsy, it can be either with the help of a radiologist, or it can be a single person guided. So earlier the radiologist used to guide, but then there are two brains behind it. So these brains might not sync together. So whatever the radiologist is pointing, they might be pointing at the lower pole. They can point even at the middle pole because there may be patients waiting for them and they want to finish it off quite fast. So quite often we used to have hematomas. Sometimes we used to miss, and a lot of things used to be happen. So we thought, why can't the nephrologist do? Because your hand-eye coordination and taking the biopsy will be much better than relying on another patient. So what we did was we did 37 biopsies by ourselves and then compared it to 37 biopsies done with the help of a radiologist. And we found that the nephrologist doing the biopsies was better, and complication rates were comparatively less in the biopsy done by nephrologists. So coming to how we do it. Excuse me. So this is a video of what we usually do. So you look at the lower pole and then identify. So you clean and drape the area. So after that, we infiltrate adequate local anesthesia. The patient is obese, you need a longer needle. And if it is too obese, you can use a spinal needle for him or her. Then we make a small nick so that the needle goes in smoothly. So after that, we put the needle and localize exactly, and then fire the needle. So this is the view from the other side. So there are two nice bits over there, and you send them to the pathologist for getting the biopsy. So after doing the biopsy, you need to look at the, you need to see whether there is any bleed or hematoma, because it has an implication, which we'll come to later. So a note about transjugular renal biopsy. So the indications for a transjugular renal biopsy are patients who have got coagulopathy, and when you want to do a simultaneous liver and renal biopsy, a transjugular route is more preferable. Those who have a morbid obesity, because sometimes the kidney will be quite deep, and imaging the kidney as well as hitting the kidney might be a problem. If there is a failed percutaneous biopsy, then you can always go in for a transjugular biopsy. Solitary kidney nowadays, because of the excellent ultrasound modalities available, and because of the low risk involved, we can still go in for a percutaneous renal biopsy. But if the patient wants to be totally risk-free, then transjugular renal biopsy is an option. So what they do over here is you introduce a vascular sheath through the renal vein into the kidney, position the vascular sheath as distally as possible, and then you use a needle tip and then puncture. And to see whether you have reached the cortex or not, what you can see is there may be a slight capsular perforation with extra, and then take the biopsy bit. The problem with the transjugular biopsy is that extravasation is quite common. But then the advantages, if the extravasation is too much, you can always block that in the same setting because you have the vascular catheter over there. So coming to the biopsy per se. So pre-biopsy, what are the things we should look at? So nowadays we do biopsy as a daycare technique. Patient gets admitted in the morning. We do it in the early in the morning so that we have the whole day to see whether they run into any trouble. And then we discharge them by about 2 or 3 p.m. in the afternoon. On the other hand, if they are from a faraway place, or if they would like to stay for 1 or 2 days, you can always admit the patient. Investigations, you should always get the coagulation profile done. Always check their hemoglobin and platelets. If the hemoglobin is low, you should always transfuse before the biopsy. NPO, we don't usually advise. We ask them to take a light meal 1 or 2 hours before the procedure. They can always have fluids before the procedure. You should always make sure that the blood pressure and sugars are controlled. An IV line has been recommended by the various bodies during the biopsy, but then again, that is a personal choice whether the patient wants to, whether you want the patient to have an IV line or not. Positioning, we do it most of the biopsies in the prone position with the pillow below the abdomen, so that the lumbar lordosis is obliterated and the lower part of the kidney comes up and we can access it more easily. But if the patient is obese, or if the patient is pregnant, and if the patient is very uncomfortable lying down, you can do it in the left lateral position, or you can do it in the sitting up position. What all pre-medications you can use? Anxiolytics are always helpful because biopsy, when you tell biopsy, at least in Kerala, what a lot of people think is malignancy. So you can always give them a small dose of alprazolam or something to relax them. Tranexamic acid, there is no evidence saying that it is helpful, but then we routinely give it so that bleeding risks, whatever it helps, we can use. Painkillers, you can we can use paracetamol or opioids as painkillers. Coming to the role of desmopressin, desmopressin was touted as a mechanism which can stop renal biopsy bleeds. But then there have been various studies using desmopressin, comparing with patients who were not using desmopressin. And what they showed was there was no significant difference in the incidence of symptomatic hematomas or hematuриas after using desmopressin. Desmopressin is not routinely advised nowadays. So coming to post-biopsy care. So after biopsy, we always advise a bed rest. At least for the next 4 to 6 hours, bed rest is advised. And you should always collect the initial 3 samples of urine and see whether there is any hematuria. BP has to be monitored till discharge. Avoid driving for 48 hours because a lot of people, once they go home, they start driving. And when we look at our roads, driving improperly might lead to a rebleed 24 or 48 hours later. So always avoid driving for at least 48 hours and avoid heavy exertion for 1 week. And you should always tell them that there is always a risk of bleeding in the initial 1 week. And if they have any unnatural pain at the back, or if they feel there is any reddish discoloration of the urine, they should immediately come to the hospital and see you. So coming to special populations that undergo biopsy. So coming to children and older children, if they are cooperative and if they can lie down properly, we can do the biopsy in the regular way. For younger children, they might need an IV sedation or a short GA. Biopsy in pregnancy is safe. It can be done in all stages, but if the lady is unable to lie down prone, then you can do it in the lateral position or in the sitting up position. First trimester might not be an issue because they'll be able to lie down. It's mainly in the second and third trimesters that you might need to change the position. The complications are no different from that of non-pregnant people. And in pregnancy, it is quite safe. So you need not worry about performing a renal biopsy during pregnancy. Another population that we see quite frequently is patients on anticoagulants due to a number of factors. They are at a higher risk of bleeding, what we have seen from the various papers. The conventional thought is you should stop or all anticoagulation for 5 to 7 days. But nowadays, in a lot of centers, icosapent is being continued and biopsy is being done. Then you can always use vitamin K and FFP to reverse the effect of anticoagulants if you feel the biopsy is needed quite early. In patients at high risk for thrombotic complications, once you stop the anticoagulation, you can always put them on unfractionated heparin, not the low molecular weight heparin, unfractionated heparin, and stop the heparin maybe 6 or 8 hours before the procedure. Do a protamine reversal, perform the biopsy, and then after that you can restart them on heparin on for 1 or 2 days, and then go back to anticoagulation. If the patient is on newer anticoagulants like apixaban or rivaroxaban, at least 3 days of stoppage has been recommended. Another population what we see is CLD. A lot of CLD patients have got associated kidney problems, which we feel biopsy is required. They have a lot of problems, including coagulopathy, thrombocytopenias, etc. We can perform biopsies safely in CLD patients after transfusing them with adequate FFPs, platelet transfusions, vitamin K, etc. Another practice what we do, this is what we have taken from the gastroenterologist, we can transfuse them with plasma while performing the biopsy, which is supposed to reduce the risk of complications. Then there is always the transjugular renal biopsy, which can do both liver and renal biopsies if you want in the same sitting. Another population what we commonly see is patients who have got hypertension. So what we have seen is the risk of bleed is high. The systolic blood pressure is more than 140 millimeters of mercury, and if the diastolic pressure is more than 90 millimeters of mercury, you should always control the BP before doing the biopsy. If the BP is more than 170, systolic BP is more than 170, then the risk goes up by 30 to 40%. Rather than the immediate rise in blood pressure, it is the duration of hypertension that is more important because of the changes that takes place in the various arterioles and the which causes an increased risk of bleeding. On the other hand, if the patient develops a new onset hypertension post biopsy, you should always keep the possibility of a perirenal hematoma, which is compressing on the kidney, and you should always do an imaging to rule out a perinephric hematoma or a Page kidney. Coming to the biopsy of the renal allograft, the technique is the same, but then the anatomy is quite different, and sometimes the kidney may be placed a bit deep, and the anatomy might be different because of the limitations with the vascularity. They might have anastomosed a bit differently. So you should watch out for ureter, bowel, and the collecting system, and be careful about the complications because sometimes if the needle goes through and if it hits the pelvic grip, pelvic rim or structures in the pelvis, sometimes catastrophes can occur. So what are the contraindications for renal biopsy? A bleeding risk, that is, if the platelet count is less than 1.2 lakhs, then they are at a very high risk of a biopsy bleed. So you can either transfuse them with platelets or you can wait. Some centers take up patients with a platelet count of more than 1 lakh. And those who have an elevated INR, who are on anticoagulation, etc., be careful and then take remedial measures before you take them up for biopsy. Those who are on anticoagulation, like we saw earlier, we can always shift them over to heparin and then do. Hypertension should be controlled before biopsy. Small hyperechoic kidneys, we don't usually biopsy because of the risk involved and because of the limited data that we might get from the biopsy sample. It is not worth the risk. Anatomical kidney problems like abnormal vascularity or multiple risks increase the bleeding risk. In such cases, you can go for a laparoscopic renal biopsy. Horseshoe kidney, the preferred route is transjugular biopsy, but if you feel that you can do it in a percutaneous time, it is worth the try. Multiple bilateral cyst means it is difficult to visualize the areas that are cyst-free. You can do a laparoscopic biopsy in such a case. In hydronephrosis, biopsy should be delayed until the obstruction is relieved and only pursued if the injury is persisting despite an adequate time. Solitary kidney, if the kidney is visible and biopsy is safe, there is no increased risk and you can do it in the percutaneous method per se. If there is an infection over the skin at the site of the needle insertion, don't do a renal biopsy. Ongoing pyelonephritis also, try not to do a renal biopsy. If the patient has got altered mental status, it is better to avoid a kidney. So this table has been taken from the AJKD core curriculum in 2019. So we usually go into biopsy thinking that we'll come out with the biopsy specimen immediately, but then there are a few conditions which we run into unexpectedly and might cause problems. So what to do in such cases? The important rule is don't panic. If you run into problems, always stay calm, stay cool. There is no point panicking. So first thing is what to do when you are not getting a sample. Sometimes it can happen, though we have an ultrasound machine, and though we feel that the needle has gone into the kidney, you might not be getting a sample. So what to do in such a case? So stay calm, look at the angle of the needle. Again, critically reassess whether you are imaging the kidney properly, whether you are seeing the tip of the angle, and whether you are seeing the tip of the angle going inside the kidney. And there might be an observer issues because if there is another person guiding you, and if there is no biopsy guide, then the chances are maybe that there is a hand-eye incoordination. So you can either do the biopsy yourself or then critically reassess and then try to do a biopsy again. Another thing is you might be hitting low because you might be thinking that you are going at the level of the renal lower pole, but then the needle might be going low or slipping off. So you can go up or go down and then try biopsying again. Always relax, take a few deep breaths, and then redo the biopsy. So what to do? Sometimes when you puncture the area, there can be bleeding because you might hit a small capillary or you might be hitting a vein, and which might cause an initial bleeding spurt. So what to do is you apply pressure. Most of the bleeds will come down on its own. But sometimes if it is a small capillary that you have injured, what you do is you can always use the artery forceps that is usually there in the biopsy tray, and then clip the artery for some time, and usually the bleeding will subside on its own. And you should always check the BP. Sometimes a patient might have gotten panicky and then the BP would have gone up, and you can bring down the BP and then reattempt the biopsy again. So each procedure has its own share of complications, and what are the complications that we see in a renal biopsy? So renal biopsy is usually quite safe, and the risk of death with renal biopsy is very, very, very rare. So this is the meta-analysis of from the CJSN, and they looked at about 118,064 native biopsies, and what they have seen is the risk of death was is 1 in 1,667 or 0.06%. The risk of bleeding was 11%, but it includes small and large bleeds. And significant bleeding, that is bleeding requiring transfusions, was only 1.6%. 3.5% had macroscopic hematuria, and bleeding requiring intervention was 0.3%. It is quite safe, but though it is quite safe, you should always tell the patient that there is a risk of bleeding, and then always obtain an informed consent, because from a legal point of view. This is again from the core curriculum, but if we look at this chart, then we won't be able to do the biopsy, because this shows a lot of complications what was not there in the previous chart, previous table. So it describes a hematoma of 75%, but what they say is this is a hematoma, that is small and large hematoma. When you're doing an invasive procedure, a small amount of bleeding is usually accepted. And though the hematoma has been described at 75%, clinically significant hematoma is only 4 to 7%. And the risk of subcapsular bleed is less than 1%. And significant bleeding can always lead to subcapsular accumulation and a Page kidney. And there is a retroperitoneal bleed risk of 5 to 10%. And it can do it due to a variety of causes. The commonest cause is inadequate rest after biopsy, because the patient might be walking around or might be driving a bike, which would have caused the clot there to get dislodged or causing a large bleed. Another problem is a pseudoaneurysm, which would have bled later. So this happens about 5 to 7 days. And in such a case, then we might need to go in for an intervention. Microscopic or gross hematuria can cause. Microscopic hematuria, we don't need to worry because it is self-limiting. Gross hematuria, again, it is alarming for the patient, because the patient feels that it is feels that there is a lot of blood is going on, but then always reassure them. Usually it will subside. You need to hydrate them properly. You can give them diuretics so that the system gets flushed. If there is a clot, you can always remove it with the help of your urology colleagues. Sometimes catheterization might be required in case there is a block, but usually this will settle on its own, and we need not worry. There might be a lumbar vessel laceration, which is quite rare, but in such a case, it is risky, because we don't know where the patient is bleeding from, and we need the help of a very skilled interventional radiologist or a good interventional cardiologist who will identify and cannulate each and every lumbar vessel and go into the particular vessel and then embolize that. Meanwhile, the patient might get bad, so it is a very risky situation. AVF formation is quite rare. It is usually benign and can be followed up. But if there is a persistent bleeding or resistant hypertension or a high output heart failure, again, you need to intervene. Pain might be there. Partly it may be because you are infiltrating a lot of local anesthetic into the muscular plane, and which might subside on its own. Sometimes delayed pain, which is sharp pricking, should be considered with, should be taken as significant, and you should do a repeat image. Infection risk is quite low if you screen the patient properly, and you can always give them a prophylactic antibiotic. Nephrectomy, the incidence is very, very low, and because nowadays we have got skilled interventional radiologists and cardiologists, the incidence of nephrectomy is quite rare. Death is very, very rare with renal biopsy. So coming to post-biopsy bleed, this is the commonest complication that we see. Those at risk are patients who have got an AKI, those who have got high creatinine, those who have got hypertension, those who have got coagulopathy, anemia, and raised creatinine. So in such patients, we need to be quite careful. It can manifest as hematuria or a perirenal hematoma. The incidence is 4 to 7% in most series, and it is less. It can be less or it can be more. The clinical features are there may be a massive bleeding into the genitourinary tract, or they can have a sharp lancinating pain. Sometimes they can present with a severe pain followed by a sudden hypotension. So that is quite dangerous. It is usually self-limiting. Interventions are required in case of any hemodynamic disturbance, or if the patient needs multiple blood transfusions, or if the patient's pain is not coming down with conservative management. So what are the factors that affect a post-biopsy bleed? So there are operator and machine factors. You are using an older generation machine and a poor probe which is not imaging properly, then there are chances that the patient might be bleeding. Various series have shown that the more experienced the operator, the lesser the risk of a bleed. But then again, renal biopsy is a very surprising procedure. Even after you might have a bleed after many years of having no complications. So each and every biopsy, we need to be careful, and we shouldn't be complacent. Size of the needle, we had a discussion by Dr. Anila. Though the needles appear bigger, we nephrologists are more confident with using the 18 gauge or 16 gauge needle. And but there is a difference between automated and semi-automated needles, and fully automated needles are preferred. Then there is another interesting study which showed that if there is an immediate hematoma, the chances of a significant bleed is much more. So this is a patient whom I biopsied. He was an obese person, 120 kgs. He came back 1 week later with a severe pain. So you look at the CT scan, you can see that there is a significant bleed at the lower pole. So we managed him conservatively, made him lie down. He did not require any transfusions, fortunately. So he was managed with frequent hemoglobin monitoring and symptomatic measures and conservative management, with which he improved. He did not require any interventional procedure. So this is another picture from AJKD. So you can see a post-biopsy bleed over here going into the retroperitoneum. So in the Doppler, you can see the bleeding into the space. So this is the angiographic view. You can see that area is it's very prominent. So they have done the coiling over here. This is the coils, and which have stopped the further bleeding. The vascular tree is taking up very well, and there is no bleeding into the previously blood area. So these are ways in which, if the patient is quite sick and who have developed a bleed, with which you can stop the bleed. However, there is another interesting fact. These coils can cause sloughing after maybe 4 or 5 days. So that is another very, very rare cause of a rebleed. So if the patient again goes into shock, we should be very careful, and we should always take them up for a repeat angiogram again. So this is an interesting study from Kidney 360. So they have shown that if the patient has got an immediate bleed on post-biopsy color Doppler, they have got a higher chance of a significant bleed, that is a perinephric hematoma, and who require a blood transfusion. So you should always look out for a color Doppler. So what we usually do is, after the biopsy, we give compression for some time, then apply the dynaplast over the area, and then once again we do the Doppler and see whether there is any small hematoma or anything which has developed over there. If we feel that it is developing, we usually keep them for 1 or 2 days and then do a periodic assessment. So coming to long-term complications of renal biopsy, AV fistulas is a well-known long-term complication. Most of them are self-limiting, but some can have recurrent episodes of bleed, or again very catastrophic bleed. So in such cases, they'll need a intervention. So most of them will settle with the angiographic intervention, but some of them might need a nephrectomy. And those who are having massive bleed can have complications like fibrosis, damage to the kidney, etc. So what are the newer directions? So we had a discussion, and Dr. Bala had shared a paper regarding a craniocaudal and caudocranial. But then when we look at that, we end up doing both procedures, because those who are obese, or those who cannot, COPD patients, etc., we won't be able to put a pillow behind them, and in such patients, automatically we end up doing a caudocranial method. Whereas in the other patients whom we are doing the proper positioning, then we'll be able to do a proper craniocaudal technique. So this is another technique which was described in radiology a few years back. This is called the cortical tangential approach. So what they do is they target only the cortex, but then the problem is you won't be able to get the medulla, and then we might miss out on a lot of diagnosis, like we saw what Dr. Anila had elaborated. So the future is with the newer probes that are being developed. They are developing higher resolution probes that can go deep down. The problem with high resolution probes is they are good at imaging the peripheries, but then their depth is limited. But with the newer probes that are in development, we'll be able to image them. The advantage is we can pinpoint out where the blood flow is more or less, and then do the biopsy appropriately. And we will be able to avoid biopsying areas with a high vascularity. Then contrast associated USC has been tried in some studies, but then again, it doesn't have much bearing over the biopsy procedure, so it is not in practice right now. So biopsy is a fantastic procedure, but what is the future of biopsy? So what has been seen in various series is that in a lot of countries, slowly nephrologists is losing control over the renal biopsy because interventional radiology have come up. And especially in countries like Australia, about 45% to 50% biopsies are done by the interventional radiologist per se. And that is coming true in a lot of corporate hospitals in India as well. So since it is an integral part of the armamentarium, we should continue training our people quite well, and we should encourage them to do biopsies. And the problem over here is this is a paper from 2019. So this was published by an interventional radiology group. The interesting thing is all the biopsies in the interventional radiology group were done by trained interventional radiologists who have had years of experience. Whereas in the kidney, all the allograft biopsies were done by nephrologists, surgeons, trainees, whoever passed that way could do the biopsy. So they concluded that biopsy done by the interventional radiologist was much better compared to the radiologist done by the interventions done by the nephrologist. But when you look at the skill group, there was a huge difference between these two, and I don't think we should entertain such papers, and we should be publishing more and more papers promoting our group per se. So coming to conclusion, renal biopsy is an essential part of the nephrologist armamentarium. It is quite safe, but it has its own share of issues, and we should treat each and every biopsies carefully, because if we see a thin patient, we get lax thinking that it is very easy, but we might land up in trouble. We need careful planning and execution, and try to come down on complications as much as possible. It is a skill that should be retained with ourselves, and we shouldn't pass it out to other specialties. So this is my team at Rinai. So thank you for a very patient listening.